That is the tale of how a little street canine became a top-notch soldier and fought alongside his nice pal in the First World War. The bad mutt spent his entire existence going through garbage cans in search of food and was often treated brutally by troglodytes who did not have an ounce of humanity. However, occasionally, the dog managed to find something to eat while walking through the streets, searching for shelter. The animal ended up losing its bone in a crowd, and while searching for food, came across a platoon of American infantrymen. Seeing the hungry dog, Robert decided to throw a cookie to him, and the animal began to follow him. The year was 1917, and the United States had gone to war against Germany. Thousands of young people from all corners of the United States had been called up to fight. When the American military entered the war, the French and British had already been battling the strong German army for 3 long years. The European soldiers were already discouraged, but their hope was renewed when they learned that America was sending help. After a few minutes of walking, the platoon reached the training center, but the dog was barred at the door, so he went searching for another passage and managed to get in by going underneath the wooden fence. His first stop was the kitchen, but the dog was chased away by the cook. While walking away from the madman, the animal finally ended up running over Robert and began sniffing him for more cookies. The boy ordered the dog to leave before he got into trouble, but it was too late because just then the dog barked and caught Sergeant Casperin's attention. Seeing the animal's good behavior, the sergeant asked Robert to give him food, and the cook was forced to share his horrible dishes with the dog, even against his will. During lunch, Hans Schroeder, a boy of German descent, remarked that he was surprised at the sergeant for letting the dog stay, but Olsen stated that the colonel would not accept the animal. During the night, he planned to sleep in Robert's bed, but the soldier forbade him from doing so and ordered the dog to sleep on the floor. The next morning, when the alarm rang, the children awoke scared and prepared for another intense day of schooling. The dog accompanied the soldiers all the way and practiced all the training alongside them. Before long, everyone became attached to the animal, including Sergeant Casperin, who praised the dog for his good performance and said that he was much fitter than most of the members of his platoon. Some nights have passed, and now Robert allows the dog to climb into his bed. The boy is determined to keep him and even chooses a name for his new buddy. From that day on, the former street dog would be called Stubby. However, Olsen says that when the colonel finds out about the dog, he'll send him away. In an attempt to avoid being separated from his pal Robert, uses his downtime to teach him a few tricks so Stubby could captivate the colonel from being expelled. Luckily, his plan works. A few days later, while the colonel is choosing the platoon, he is impressed to see the dog saluting and states that the animal is as welcome within the army as any man. That afternoon, the soldiers have to move through one last training session before they are sent to the battlefield. Casperin orders his men to put on their gas masks and takes them into a barn. After releasing the tear gas, he orders the young men to remove their masks, and immediately everyone starts coughing. At that moment, the sergeant opens the door for them to leave and says that in war, they will face even worse gases. That is why they need to keep their masks by their side at all times. Since there are no masks for dogs, Stubby has to use his paws to protect himself from the remnants of smoke coming out of the barn. In the following weeks, even Biscuits begins to like the animal and always gives him extra food, all while giving new commands to the platoon, which is ready to go to France to fight alongside the French. The colonel says he is proud of them all and states that Stubby would be a great assistant to help train the next soldiers. Upon hearing this, Robert realizes that the time has come to say goodbye to his friend. Before he leaves, he writes one last letter to Margaret, his older sister, and packs his bag for the journey. Stubby does not understand what is going on, but he realizes that Robert is unhappy and reaches into his suitcase. However, the boy promises he will be back soon and gives the dog a parting gift. The animal takes some time to get used to the collar, but is happy to see himself in the mirror wearing it. Robert then ties a rope around the dog and takes him into the kitchen. The cook agrees to stay with Stubby until the boy returns and assures him that he will take good care of him. Heartbroken, Robert hands the dog over, and the cook ties him up in a corner of the kitchen. Determined to follow his friend wherever he goes, Stubby manages to untie the rope and breaks free. He follows Robert sent through the streets and jumps on a train because he knows the boy is inside. Once they arrive at the pier, the animal sees his friend boarding the ship and sneaks in among some boxes of supplies to get on the vessel. During the long journey, Stubby comes out of his hiding place and makes sure not to be seen while following Robert's trail. Soon, the dog finds the room where the soldiers are huddled together to sleep and sniffs shoe by shoe until he identifies the boy's feet. To his surprise, Robert is woken up in the middle of the night and is extremely happy to see the dog. Now his concern is that the animal will be discovered, and for this, he enlists the help of his friends. The trio intends to hide Stubby, but he is ultimately found by the captain. Upon receiving the dog's greeting, the man orders the soldiers to make an identification plate for him and allows the animal to become an official member of the platoon. After they reach their destination, the soldiers walk through the trenches and are startled to see the bleak situation of the French, who have been at war for years. As expected, Stubby finds a way to make himself useful. As soon as he arrives at the camp, he starts his work by scaring all the pests out of the trenches. It is not long before the young soldiers witness their first attack, and Robert is committed to protecting his friend at all costs. From his first day at the war front, the dog takes on an important role to help rescue soldiers who have been wounded or buried. During lunch, Robert asks the cook to serve some food to his dog, but the man refuses. At this point, Hans is furious and claims that Stubby is the true mascot of his platoon. Enraged, the cook insults the boy and says he will not take orders from a German. To protect his buddy, Olsen jumps into the argument and fights with the Frenchman. Suddenly, Gaston shows up to separate them and forces them to reconcile. Gaston then tells them that his captain has ordered him to work alongside Robert while they take a break for lunch. The Frenchman tells them that his officers have asked him, Robert, and Stubby to keep an eye on the Germans. Hans and Olsen are also invited to help them with their mission and are terrified when they see, for the first time, an entire town that has been destroyed by the Germans. The group walks for several hours until they reach the camp, and the next morning, Gaston is to wake Robert in order to begin their espionage mission. Hiding in the trees, the pair uses binoculars to see what the enemy army is up to and find that they intend to use poisonous gas to attack them. Immediately, they run to sound the alarm, and Stubby spots an enemy soldier hiding among the trees. Robert is about to be shot when the dog knocks him down, preventing the boy from being hit by a bullet. They keep running to get to the horses, but the animals are startled by the sound of gunfire and run away. At Robert's request, Stubby goes to warn the squad guys about the attack, which allows them to prepare to face the fuel. Then the dog will warn the citizens of the neighboring village, and everyone runs to their houses before the gasoline reaches the town. Gaston and Robert show up and rescue the animal. They run to cover in a barn, and Gaston improvises a mask for Stubby using a damp material to cover his snout. When the fuel invades the metropolis, all of the residents are safe and wait patiently until the impact of the gas has worn off. Minutes later, the air is clear again, and all of us are alive, thanks to the American hero Stubby. The heroism of that little being helps Robert bear the passing of days in that horrible region. On the way back to camp, Stubby manages to hunt a rabbit, and Gaston uses the animal's meat to make a nice soup. After dinner, the Frenchman invites Robert for a walk, and Stubby accompanies them while they talk. Gaston shows the young man a picture of his family. He has a beautiful wife and 3 daughters whom he has not seen for years. Robert tells how his parents died some years ago and that his older sister Margaret was the one who took care of him and his 2 younger sisters. But even amidst this chaos, the boy still hopes to return to the United States and build his own family. While contemplating the night in the mountains, the camp suffers an attack. The trio rushes to assist them. Private Claiborne was wounded on the other side of the barrier, and the sergeant says they need to find him immediately. Stubby rushes to the area where the bombing is taking place and deflects the attacks as he begins his rescue mission. Concerned, Robert goes after his buddy, and the dog begins barking when he finds the wounded soldier. Soon after, other soldiers show up to rescue their comrade, and all manage to return safely to camp. Several months pass, and the platoon of young Americans moves to a new battle area in Chapari. Before he leaves, Stubby is given a small robe as thanks for alerting the villagers about the fuel. Gaston also has a gift for him and mentions that his sergeant made a gas mask specifically for the dog. As soon as they arrive at their new destination, the young men undergo an attack, and Stubby lures some German invaders into being captured by Robert and Gaston. Minutes later, explosives begin to be thrown into the trenches, and Stubby catches one of them to prevent Olsen from being hit. But while saving his companion, the dog ends up being injured by the explosion, and Robert runs to help him. Hans is also wounded, and Olsen seeks a doctor to assist him. In the meantime, Robert rushes into the medical ward with his buddy in his arms and begs for someone to help him, considering the dog has sustained a severe injury. He needs to be transferred to a hospital, and the doctor asks Robert to place him in the ambulance. Then Hans arrives, being carried on a stretcher, and they both proceed together to the hospital. After Hans and Stubby are injured, the conflicts in Chapprie become even worse, and the rains arrive in the area. It rains every day without truce, causing the entire place to become one large swamp. For all the weeks he was away from his friend, Robert felt completely lost. The only thing he could do was hope that Stubby was still alive. Gradually, the Germans managed to advance toward Paris, and the only thing stopping them from succeeding was the American soldiers working in tandem with the French. The friendship between Gaston and Robert only grew stronger during this hazy period until Gaston was ordered to return to the base of his regiment. At this point, Robert feels even more alone, for he has just lost the company of yet another friend. After many days of intense battles, the French and American soldiers managed to recapture Seicheprey and force the Germans to retreat. One night during a bombing raid, Robert writes a letter to his sister Margaret in which he attempts to reassure her about the battle. The boy claims to be fine and says that even the food is good enough that he can eat almost anything. Robert mentions that it has been almost a month since Stubby was injured, and he has not yet received any information about his friend. Nevertheless, the boy remains hopeful that the dog is being well cared for, and he hopes that the war will be over very soon. When Hans wakes up in the hospital, Stubby is by his side. The dog is almost fully recovered, but he still has an injury on one of his paws. When Stubby realizes that Robert is not there, the animal decides to go after him and takes a long walk to find him. He is already starving when he smells sausages being prepared by several German soldiers. Stubby sneaks around and steals the food, but he then has to run away to avoid being shot. One morning, when Olsen gets up, he realizes that Robert is not well. The boy is coughing desperately and can barely get up. His friend then calls a doctor to examine him, and the physician states that he is very ill. Therefore, he will need to be taken for follow-up to receive the necessary treatment. In 1918, the world was hit by a deadly flu epidemic. Robert also contracted this illness, and the virus spread swiftly among the soldiers. Robert was not able to keep up, and all he wanted at that moment was to see his friend Stubby again. In the meantime, the dog follows the trail of his best buddy, but hunger, fatigue, and the injury to his paw prevent him from proceeding. After a few minutes of rest, Stubby manages to regain his strength and continues his quest to find Robert. In the dead of night, while on watch, Olsen spots something moving among the trees and grabs his gun, believing it to be an enemy soldier. However, the boy is pleasantly surprised when he finds that Stubby has returned and managed to locate them. Robert is hanging by a thread when he receives a visit from his best friend. Stubby's presence gives him the strength he needs to recover, and as the days go by, the boy gets better. After 6 months of arduous fighting, Robert and Stubby take a leave of absence to visit Paris together with their American friends. Upon arriving in the beautiful city, Olsen and Hans approach two lovely young women who are walking along the streets while Robert goes to take a nice bath. Initially, the French did not get along with the Americans at all, but by the end of 1918, they had come to admire them and felt very grateful for all the support they provided. After a long night's rest, Robert and Stubby leave the hotel to explore Paris and take lovely pictures throughout the city's landmarks. In September 1918, it was announced that the war was coming to an end and that the German army was retreating. In the middle of the night, Stubby sneaks out and attacks a German soldier. The man is a spy and tries to get rid of the dog, but Robert and his companions arrive in time to stop him. In light of this act of bravery, the captain awards Stubby the honorary title of sergeant. From that day on, Sergeant Stubby wears the insignia of the U.S. Army, and Private Robert becomes the corporal of his platoon. To the boy's amazement, Gaston shows up to congratulate him on his remarkable achievement. In the days that followed, the headlines of all the newspapers announced the final assault on the Germans during the war. A soldier appeared to bring great news. He announced that the war had finally come to an end and that the Germans were going to sign a treaty to cease fire. However, this treaty would not be signed until the next day, so until then, both sides were still at war. That afternoon, the soldiers rested in the shade of an oak tree. Olsen states that he plans to get married when he returns home. Gaston confesses that he has been away for so long that he fears his family won't recognize him. On November 11, 1918, the two companies faced each other in their last battle. It is difficult to understand why the soldiers were forced to fight until the last minute of that conflict. On that morning, many young men lost their lives, taking all their dreams with them. Seeing his friend Gaston in danger, Robert and Stubby rushed to his aid, and the alarm sounded at that very moment, announcing the end of the conflict. In the middle of the battlefield, Stubby finds Olsen's helmet and brings it to Hans. Upon examining the helmet, the boy discovers a hole indicating that Olsen was shot in the head. Everyone is deeply saddened by the boy's death, but relieved to know that they will never have to endure such suffering again. That same day, Gaston bids farewell to his American friends who are about to return to their country. Upon arriving in America, the soldiers are greeted with great celebration, and Sergeant Stubby makes history by appearing in all the newspapers as the most decorated dog in the U.S. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, leave a comment about your favorite movie, and we will make it next. Thanks for watching.